A strong gale wind was noted in a report to the bridge the morning after we anchored at Bremerhaven during the return passage to the States. The storm had veered much farther east than anticipated, and since there were 350 nautical miles between us and the turn to Germany, we had to take shelter in the harbor of English Portsmouth. There was nothing wrong with this except that protocol required us to leave the harbor again at the next turn. Nevertheless, the order was given. Head for Portsmouth and wait for a later departure. The Panama-registered container ship Molly Sen is 260 meters long and carries 6,250 TEUs of cargo, mostly industrial goods and components for auto assembly plants in the States. This was my 18th trip across the pond and back on the Molly. When we docked in Charleston, I had a few decisions to make. Soon to be 30 years old, retirement, and health insurance if I wanted to use it. Standing off the port side, I watched the harbor master come aboard to unbolt the bridges and bring the Molly into the channel and dock. This is a common practice required in most busy commercial ports. Roger Chafee is the captain. I knew him when he worked at the port in Southampton and as a shipmate many years ago. One of the best in the world. Good to see you, Max. When we're done here, we'll grab a bite to eat and have a pint of beer on the ferry, eh? He didn't so much ask as announce, and I'd never turned down his hospitality. You know we will, I grinned. Later that evening, when my second had gone on watch, I joined my old friend at the Ferry House Hotel, and over the best fish and chips to be found in the South, we indulged in reminiscences of former glories and tall tales from both sides of the pond. How is your beautiful missus doing in the Holy City? He asked me after we'd retold 100 tales of misadventure. He caught my pause and must have seen the pain imprinted in my eyes. He'd been there a couple times himself. It was the scourge of the sea, and he shook his head in acknowledgement. We broke up a couple crossings ago. I found another guy to keep her warm while I was gone. Jesus, buddy, I hate to hear that. He motioned for the barmaid to bring us a couple shots. Let's drink to good women, wherever they are. Roger was right. It's just that I always thought Tammy Waters was a good woman until she turned into something else. 6 months earlier. God, it feels good to set foot on solid ground again, I said to my first officer, dragging the tote behind me. He was leaving for Greenville upstate, and we would meet again in 6 weeks. The crew and another captain of the Molly were going to take a trip to South America and back as soon as they recharged. I can give you a ride, Captain. It's no problem, he said, snuggling up to his fiancée. I agreed and asked him to drop me off at the town market where I bought a dozen roses for Tammy. White on long stems, her favorite. We were coming into port a couple days early, and I wanted to surprise her. I usually called aboard when we were a day or two away from sailing to see what she had planned. The neighborhood was filled with tourists and College of Charleston kids, and the aroma of countless culinary delights filled the outdoor markets and streets around us. I settled in the area a couple years after Hurricane Hugo hit the beautiful city, finding a townhouse on Anson Street at an undervalued price. Apparently, the owners from New Jersey were fed up with our subtropical climate after the hurricane tore off a chunk of the old roof. Their loss and my gain. So, over the course of a few years, I brought the house up to par with the historic charm of the neighborhood and, with the help of an old blacksmith, restored all the wrought iron fencing on the street and garden sides. When it was finished, it was a 3-story townhouse in pastel pink colors with dark green hurricane shutters, and there was no one to live in it. I would go to sea for 10 weeks and be in my home port for 6 weeks. For a 26-year-old ship's engineer a few years out of high school, I think I did pretty well. A few years later, Tammy Waters introduced herself by pressing the doorbell. I expected another young student to replace the girl who had just graduated from college and moved back home. Having left the house empty on my first few trips to the sea, I continued to worry about it until one of my buddies suggested renting out rooms to reliable tenants. There were quite a few such people among the students, and I ended up renting out 2 rooms on the 3rd floor to several girls, and from then on, when one of them graduated from college, another would find a replacement for her. I was expecting a replacement when I opened the door. Mr. Banyan, good afternoon. I'm Tammy Waters. I understand you plan to rent a room to my sister, Patty Waters. She froze in anticipation as I opened the door for her to enter. Yes, she seems like a lovely girl, and the young lady who left recently highly recommended her, I replied. Well, I told her I would check her out. You can never be too careful these days. I offered her a drink, and to my surprise, she chose an IPA, which greatly increased my opinion of this family. What struck me even more was her stunning beauty. She reminded me of a young Catherine Zeta-Jones, dark hair, full lips. She toured the chambers and I gave her a full tour of the house, ending at the narrow patio next to and behind the house. I had decorated the small patio with a few plants and pots of flowers. In the soft evening light, it was a wonderfully romantic garden. Unfortunately, with the midday sun and 90-degree heat and humidity in Charleston, it wasn't exactly romantic. Nevertheless, she agreed, and the next night I took her and her sister out to dinner. A date followed, and another, until we became one of those semi-dependent couples who live together until one or the other forces them to break up. At the time, it wasn't necessary. Tammy understood my naval career. Her father was a career military man in the Navy. She was an assistant professor of fine arts in college and could get a position if she wanted to. Since we both loved the city, it made sense that she would accept the position and stay if the opportunity presented itself, and we both settled as circumstances allowed. We were a married couple for almost 3 years before she decided to move in with me and rent out her small bungalow west of the Ashley River. By then, I was a 35-year-old engineer aspiring to become a first officer as soon as the opportunity presented itself. It was strange at first, although by then I had been renting out rooms to mostly college girls for almost a decade and continued to do so even after Tammy moved in. I had no shortage of female company before I met her, though I had always been reticent about socializing with girls living in the house. Some people thought it was strange. Nah, by the time we married, I was 40 and she was almost 36. There were no children in our future. She couldn't give birth for medical reasons, though she seemed resigned to it from the moment she found out in her early 20s. Given our lifestyles, this was never a problem for either of us. I must admit that I have had temptations over the years, but I suppose it's not impossible. I have visited over 100 ports over the years, from Charleston to the Orient, and even to the distant shores of Pechora, in bitter Russia. In most ports, there are always women of various persuasions, some in lower positions, others receiving captain's pay, but with few exceptions, when I was free, I always avoided these entertainments. Tammy had her own temptations. There were so many men to play with at home and at school, and I spent weeks on the high seas riding the waves. We had an understanding. We didn't cheat on each other because we didn't want to. Sure, either of us could get drunk out of our minds and the other would never know it unless we missed, but we had to trust each other not to do it. I trusted her, and I know she trusted me, so after several years of marriage and a long life together before, I was walking down Anson Street feeling the well-being of our lives. "Good morning, Mr. Banyan. Did you have a good trip?" Mr. Shields had been my neighbor since I bought the house. His wife had died a few years earlier, and he had taken up another love, growing orchids in his roof garden. "Yes, sir. Calm seas and good food on this coast." I waved back at him as I rounded the corner of my house. The latch on the iron gate leading into the yard from the side wall had recently broken off and required welding to fix, but it still kept the gate closed. I never enter the house through the front door. I've always found it convenient to look around the garden before entering the house. Tammy parks at the curb and uses the front door, as do visitors, but my customs are unhistorical. The back door leads to a short hallway that leads to the kitchen and pantry, and then to the front rooms and bathroom. I tossed my jacket on the back of a kitchen chair and found a vase of flowers. She'd left a couple croissants in a box from the bakery on the counter, and I helped myself to them before entering the front living room and taking off my shoes. It was still a little while before dinner, so I headed upstairs to change and unpack. Maybe it was because of my engineering background and commitment to detail, but I noticed it quickly and it caught my eye. The toilet seat was up, and when I stepped into the shower, there was a body wash on the shelf that I'd never seen before. A blue gel, more of a natural scent, not at all what Tammy would use. It was something masculine, like a toilet bowl with a raised seat. The latter had been a problem in the past. In all the years that the young women had lived in the house, I had never seen a raised seat in the other 2 bathrooms. Tammy often chided me for this, but after a few months of living together, she had accustomed me to the needs of the weaker sex. So seeing the seat in our bathroom after I had been gone for almost 10 weeks was disturbing. I guess it's not as disturbing as catching them in the act. One of my buddies caught this sad scene and spent a month in jail after making sure the other guy spent his month in a cell, and they weren't even married yet. No, it was bad enough. although I kept telling myself that there could be a damn good reason why the seat was up, and there was a man's washcloth in my bathtub. I couldn't think of one, but there could be one. All right. I finished getting dressed and went downstairs to check the messages from the board, and then went back outside, made a kind face, and headed to Henry's house for a pint of beer. Henry's is a local pub nearby, geared towards those of us who like to have a good drink and listen to jazz to calm down a bit. The bar is run by my old friend Such, and I can always count on special treatment and advice whether I want it or not. "You look like a cat on a walk, old man," he called out to me as I walked in. People from the meat market didn't leave until the evening, so there were a few regulars in the establishment. "When did you get back?" "Didn't you hear my whistle? I gave you 2 quick ones," I replied. He just laughed and said he thought it was the little mark that could. Satch got his nickname for his pleasant looks and charm, and for the cool jazz he liked to play at the joint. He liked his regulars too, although we'd been changing them lately. Myself and a half-dozen others frequented the place over the years. We lost a couple people to conniving spouses, and a few more moved away. "Maximilian's Gold IPA is on deck," he announced into the microphone. His name is Maxwell, but I never paid attention to his quirky expressions. "Hey, before I forget, Dave Hoff was here asking if you guys had stopped by yet." That Dave was one of the regulars we'd lost to an affair with his spouse in a new place, but he's a young guy with a solid head on his shoulders. His ex-wife Tracy, on the other hand, is a stupid bitch, but give her time and she'll figure it out. She's lost one of the good guys. "He left a letter here for you," Such exclaimed from the end of the bar. I opened it, savoring the delicious beer, and was surprised to find an invitation to a wedding in Lake Texoma, Oklahoma. My laughter could probably be heard all the way down the street. "He's marrying his damn ex's sister, for crying out loud." I roared with excitement. The date was set in 4 weeks, and considering I had 6, it all seemed doable. "So, let's drink to Dave and the crazy shit he's about to get into." I raised a toast to our little group coming together on this day. Then I tipped my pint and gathered my thoughts to head outside. Tammy didn't get home until 8 in the evening, and I didn't call her to let her know I was back. Instead, I just sat in a chair by the window in the living room looking outside, and at one point almost wished I had one of those soft-haired house cats. We had 2 of them on our ship, even though that was officially forbidden by the rules. The sidewalk was already starting to sink into dusk when her car pulled up to the curb a couple places later, and I was just finishing my second pint of ale since returning to the house. I had a million questions, twice as many doubts, and not a single answer, especially as I watched the 2 of them approach the sidewalk. I was pretty damn sure they were both about to head toward their nest when she turned, put her arms around the man, and sent him into the Audi across the street with a kiss, the one with the College of Charleston faculty sticker on the windshield. I'd met him before. He was the head of the department where she worked, a swaggering man with the intellect of a scholar and the temperament of a fool, a good dozen years older than I was. I almost laughed to myself. Tammy is a very beautiful woman, and if she needed a lover, she could have found any number of suitors a dozen years younger than her, if not more. But instead she lusted after a toad of a man. It can't be seniority, she already has it. She's not short of money, and I know I satisfy her in bed. I just shook my head and turned toward the door as the key slid the deadbolt back into the frame. She walked into the foyer and sighed as if it was the end of a long day. I remembered for a moment our first meeting in this same foyer. In my mind's eye, she was still just as beautiful, until a spot of ugliness showed through. She headed toward the kitchen, and perhaps it was a premonition or the startled squeak of my imaginary cat, she stopped and turned around. The room was dark, but I could see it in her eyes as she brought her hand up to her mouth. "Oh my God, are you home?" she asked, as if the ghost standing before her was just a figment of her imagination. "A horn sounded this afternoon. Was that you?" I just nodded and looked out the window. She had to know I'd seen them from my seat. How could she not know? "Why didn't you call me?" "I decided to surprise you by coming back early. I probably should have called." She paused for a moment, then her artistic inclinations kicked in. "Max, oh no. Thomas, we were just having dinner tonight, that's all." She tried to smile, but even in her years of apprenticeship, she had failed to master the artistry that her husband's training required. "May I assume he paid and expected more at the door?" "Max, please, it wasn't like that." She tried, but she should have known that the curtain came down after the hug, not before. What was it like, Tammy? What was it like with the toad? She tried her best, but eventually she realized I knew. We both knew she was having fun with Thomas Pryor, PhD and womanizer of other people's wives. I'm going to be gone for a while. You need to get a few things and stay somewhere else for a while. Maybe with Thomas. You can take him his cool mountain breeze in the shower if that's his. Max, please, we can… I just held up my hand. She cried softly and my heart shattered. I understood it during the day, but when it was just the two of us in the dark living room, the pain was excruciating, at least for me. I guess it all caught up with me when I left the house and walked down the street toward the East Bay. I didn't have any particular direction, but taking only a handful of pretzels and a croissant with me, I needed something to eat. At a saloon on Market Street, I ordered wings and fried mushrooms, which the waitress served. It's always a mixed crowd here, more young people, but they absolutely have the best wings on the peninsula. The waitress gave me a seat and I considered the situation. Thomas Pryor was already married, but that didn't matter. He might like Tammy's ass more than his own wife, and I'm damn sure he does. Word on the street is that Mrs. Pryor can wrestle cows on the side. I know it's wrong to think of her that way, but I had to laugh at my own amusement to keep my levity and sanity. Still, he and or someone was playing in my house, and Tammy had to know that was cause for concern. When I entered the house, it was dark, almost surprisingly quiet compared to the nice house I had returned to a few years ago. Tammy hadn't packed much, as far as I could tell, and her car was gone. When I checked the shower, the bath gel had been removed. Maybe she took it with her or threw it away, I didn't care. Feeling like a beaten man, I threw my shirt over the bedpost and fell into a restless sleep. When dawn broke, I gave up the habit and skipped breakfast, deciding instead to take my bike and ride to Battery on the peninsula. I needed to rest and think, and sitting on a stone battery overlooking the harbor and distant surroundings provides exceptional opportunities for both. The problem with thinking is that you can think too much and end up overthinking everything you were initially thinking. Of course, I've had to struggle with visual images. All the thoughts of what they were doing only added to the irritation. And then there were the really important things. I didn't want this marriage to fall apart. I had put too much time and soul into it to destroy it like this. Whether it was my first tryst with Pryor, or whether I'd had several men in my bed, perhaps several years in a row. Therein lies the problem. Thinking too much when the mind is idle or unloaded. Both lead to an almost Faustian bargain to make things right. Almost an exchange of the soul for things to be as they were before. And therein lies the problem. I no longer knew with certainty how things used to be. One thing I did know for sure was that I would have to sit down and talk to Tammy, pushing back the clouds of destruction for the time being. Her boss had entertained her in my bed while I was on sea duty, and apparently she didn't see anything wrong with that. It was a big hurdle to overcome if possible, and I didn't know if it was possible. I found out later that Tammy had gone to stay with her sister, the same one who had rented a room from me when we first met. Tammy kept her bungalow and, when her sister's marriage broke up, allowed her to move in after the previous tenant's lease was up. Whether or not Pryor had met her there, I didn't know. We'd have to wait to talk. A fine rain pounded on the kitchen window overlooking the backyard, and we were alone within the walls of a house that had become lonely rather than content. She looked good, but also haggard, if that's possible. Maybe it was my imagination or wishful thinking. I don't know. Max, this isn't what I wanted. Please believe me. What did you want, Tammy? I replied, trying to catch her thoughts. She didn't know how to answer that question. Heck, I couldn't blame her for that. I wouldn't know how to answer that question myself if I were in her shoes. Is Pryor really what you want? She only laughed dejectedly, her face expressing contradiction. God, no. We can hardly work together now. It was a stupid mistake, Max, one for which there is no excuse. And yet you've gotten close this week? I'd been fishing, but she didn't know that. No, Max, I broke up with him completely the night I left here. I called him from the bungalow. He wouldn't put up with it, but when I threatened to tell Sophie, he shut up. I pictured Sophie Pryor, all 200 pounds of her, pinning Thomas to the ground and crushing his glasses off his nose, and smiled slightly. Of all the possible assholes, Tammy, why the hell did you get involved with that damn toad? I don't get it. I don't know, I really don't, except that he kept pushing me, reminding me how much I owed him for my tenure. He kept supporting me, keeping me company, reminding me how lonely I was. Soon we started having dinner, then drinks. He started taking me to his favorite places. I became comfortable. One night he got me drunk and carried me home. I did it of my own free will, although if I hadn't been drunk that first time, it never would have happened. Nevertheless, it did happen. We did it for about a month until you came back. Here's the million-dollar question, Tammy. You know what it is. People ask, how many were there before Peg showed up? If I thought she was going to laugh trying to answer, I was wrong. 3. There were 3 other men before Thomas. I wanted to be surprised, but not surprised and amazed at the same time. Every one of them was before we were married, Max, before I moved in with you, and you don't know any of them. None of them still live here. They were students. That surprised me. But before I could respond, she continued. It was hard for me when you were at sea, Max. It was damn hard for a long time, but I love you and I didn't let you know it. Then I just decided you'd do it every now and then in some faraway place and never know about it. That was years ago, and honestly, I can't lie about it. It was just a physical pleasure, and it really took the edge off maybe once a month or so when you went for a walk. There was no romance or relationship involved. Maybe it's because I live alone and my man is away so often. When I committed to you by moving in with you, I was calm until the last trip. And now I've ruined it, haven't I? I believed her, and the fact that it was all so far in the past, before she moved in with me, wasn't a problem. Though the dishonesty was still present, I'd never done that to her. Tammy, I'm concerned about the current situation. Pryor has taken up residence in my damn bed, and I need time to get over it if I can. If I can't, well, I don't know. Her tears started, and I held out a tissue to her. After a long pause, she continued, I do know. That's why I'm doing something I really didn't want to do. I'm going to accept a 6-month scholarship to a university in Vancouver. It will allow me to leave Pryor, and I won't have to give up my position and seniority in Charleston. They'll send someone to take my place. That was quick. You made that decision before we even talked? I didn't say anything because I wasn't going to do it. Things have changed now, haven't they? Yes, unfortunately. You know, I'm about to turn 30 and I've had to make some decisions. It certainly complicates things. She didn't say anything, but I could read a pained confession in her words. Oh, and I should have told you sooner. Dave Hoff is getting married again next month, and I plan to attend the wedding. He's marrying Tracy Torres' sister. I wasn't expecting that. If you're still here, I can put our problems aside for a while if you're interested. I said it to give her a chance, but it didn't really matter. I wish I knew. I'll be in Vancouver by the end of the month. It's probably for the best, Max. At that, we parted and exchanged a painful hug before she headed back to West Ashley. Dave was an old acquaintance of mine from Henry's house, and I suppose the antics of drinking buddies didn't always translate into old family friend status. Besides, maybe she was right. Tammy flew to Vancouver a week after our conversation. We had dinner the night before she left, but things remained the same. We unofficially parted ways to give each of us the space we needed. I made no demands, and she offered nothing. I think it was the last point that caused the most concern. We both like an active life when we are together. Would I be able to live without him for 6 months? Of course I could, but would I want to, knowing that my separated wife was off alone on her new cosmopolitan adventure? I suppose a lot will depend on what decisions we come to in the coming weeks and months. We'll either perish as a couple or find a way back. I had flown into DFW the night before and waited until the morning to drive to the sentencing site for Dave, as I called him in conversation with my old friend, to congratulate him. It was an easy trip down Highway 75, and crossing the Red River in Oklahoma allowed me to cross another state off my list of states visited or passed. Max, come with me. I want you to meet some good people. Dave smiled broadly, taking his new bride under his arm, and I followed them to the crowd gathered on the dock. I had already formally met most of them at the wedding. So this is the captain, an interesting young woman asked. Max, this is Winona Gustafson. He introduced me to his new old in-laws and a charming woman named Susan, whom I had already met in Charleston. And surprisingly, his ex-wife Tracy, his new wife's sister, was there with her new beau. I thought it would be awkward, but they apparently made up. Somehow I found myself paired with Winona for the entire evening. even though I realized I was a few years older than her. It didn't matter. She taught me to dance two pas for the rest of the evening, and we had a great time. But I behaved like a perfect gentleman, and we parted merrily. Nothing more. I got the feeling that she wanted to add sea captain to her conquests, but I had Tammy on my mind as well. From my perspective, that would have been wrong. Nevertheless, it was a wonderful temptation if true. The happy couple left for their honeymoon, and I headed south to the Texas Hill Country, to San Antonio, to spend a few days there. I had been to that city many years ago, but never found the opportunity to return. A friend pulled some strings, and I was able to stay for 3 nights at the Menger Hotel, located next door to the Alamo downtown. This was something I hoped Tammy and I could do when I retired, travel the country and visit places like this. I sat in the old bar at the Menger Hotel and listened to stories about Teddy Roosevelt riding his horse right into the bar, and hundreds of other stories about Texas Rangers that the bartender had retold probably 1,000 times. For the rest of the evening, I'd pour myself a drink upstairs and do it all over again the next night. A week later, I was preparing for another port call with a load of uncertain marriages and decisions I couldn't make. Almost 6 months later, the passage eastward had already lasted 14 days when we approached the lights of the gantry cranes on the Bremerhaven waterfront. With mostly calm seas, the voyage was uneventful except for one offshore stop where the engineers made a quick repair to the stern shaft. After that stop, Molly Sane would spend 6 days in port. We waited for the last third of the Borg Warner parts ordered to arrive at the dock before setting sail. The extra 3 days gave me the opportunity to give most of the crew a vacation so they could do what the crew does in 3 days of freedom. Captain Banyan, perhaps you would like to have dinner with me tonight? A tall, distinguished gentleman asked me after we went through customs inspection. Dennis Toller was the master of several hats and roles, chief among them Director of Port Operations in Bremerhaven. When the most powerful man in the port asks you to join him for dinner, you do. We ended up at the Soot Deern restaurant with his daughter, a 40-year-old dark-eyed beauty named Kirsten. Max, do you ever pick up passengers when you make transitions? Kirsten asked. Last summer, I invited a couple of young college students to make the crossing from New York to Southampton. They thought it would be a grand adventure, but I suspect they got very bored after the first few days. We don't have elegant cabins or nightly entertainment, unless you consider poker games between crew members entertaining. The gleam in her eyes gave away her adventurous spirit, and I sensed that she would find her own entertainment if necessary. I used to fly regularly to New York with my ex-husband, and I remember looking down trying to see the ships on the water, but I could never see them. It seemed too high up. I always wanted to go on a trip like that just for the adventure. I knew she would cause quite a stir among the ship's crew. Well, Miss Kirsten, if you ever decide you want to kill 12 days or more crossing the cold Atlantic, let me know and we'll reserve a place in one of the cabins. I think we have a few boxes taking up space, but let me know and we'll make it cozy. I couldn't keep from giggling. Principal Toller just laughed and warned me that I may have sent an invitation to regret. The Molly Senna vessel was fueled, bulkheads securely fastened, when the harbor master led us out of the harbor. 6,250 containers were in the hold, and on board, when my engineer cranked the propeller and steered us into the North Sea. As we set sail, a winter storm was raging off the northeast coast of the U.S. and was due to pass over Iceland, and the Department of the Interior cleared us to proceed. By the time we entered the English Channel off Guernsey, the storm had shifted to the east and was directly in our northern path across the pond. A front had formed over Greenland and was moving southward, making it difficult to predict the storm's eastward shift. The office made the decision for us. We would dock at Portsmouth and put to sea as soon as conditions improved. Roger Chaffee sat across from me as the barmaid brought a fresh batch of ale and a couple of shots of whiskey to the table. I first met him when I was first mate, and he was first officer on a Maersk container ship out of Southampton in 2002. His first wife had left him a couple years before, and he had become quite the ladies' man. I showed him my ring, and he only grinned. "Geez, buddy, are you sure?" I was sure the image of Tammy overpowered any carnal pleasure I might have gotten from this escapade. But it didn't matter. Roger disappeared up the stairs with both girls, one on each arm, and I didn't see him again until noon the next day. He couldn't wipe the grin off his face all the way to the dock if he had to. "So she's gone for good?" he asked me. I told him the story of the return trip, my discoveries, and her last 6 months in Vancouver. I may not have noticed the pain, or hardly noticed it at all, but any discerning person could see it written all over my face. I don't know, Roger. I usually talk to her every week or so for a few minutes. We agreed right away that it would be appropriate, but since I haven't seen her since she left, I really don't know. Do you want her to come back? There it was. The ultimate money question. As we sat around the kitchen table on Anson Street, I would immediately answer, yes, of course I want her back. I still do, but at what cost? She had 6 months to go through as many lovers as she wanted, if any. The same with me, though there were none. With her, I didn't know. I didn't think there were any before, and what did I know then? That's a difficult question, my friend. You'll have to ask me about it after she returns to Charleston, if she does. We sat for a while longer, enjoying the beer and the small company. Several middle-aged women made small talk with us, and we probably could have competed for a prize, but the luggage we both carried discouraged that thought. Roger was dating a serious woman, and by this time he had pretty much weeded his oats and was saving up his strength for the woman he intended to make his bride. She was a sturdy Englishwoman from the north, beautiful and womanly attractive, and if a sailor can define what love is to him, she was it. As for myself, I had a hand and a vivid imagination, though I must admit that temptations were always present. I just didn't give in to them, as long as I thought there was any hope of reconciliation. The next morning when I replaced the second officer on watch, it was raining heavily on the bridge. The storm had indeed moved further east, and the wind in the channel had increased. By mid-morning, the loaders had switched off the gantry cranes, and almost all work in the dock had ceased. "We're taking on a passenger, sir," the steward informed me after the crew had finished securing additional ties. "She'll come aboard as soon as the storm subsides and we can sail." This was unwelcome news, given the timing. I was sure the ship's galley wasn't ready to accommodate a paying passenger, and we'd have to vacate an extra cabin to make room. "Did you say she? Where did she come from?" I asked, remembering the conversation at dinner on previous evenings. "Exeter, sir." The steward busied himself with preparing the passengers, and I returned to my duties, watching the storm for the next few hours. By early evening, we were put in line to sail, hopefully by early morning. "Our passenger, Miss Seaver, has come aboard, sir, and the first mate has escorted her to her cabin. Shall I set the captain's table for 9 o'clock this evening, sir?" When we have a passenger, paid or unpaid, we usually have a meeting immediately after embarkation and before sailing to discuss a few rules and expectations, and to give a safety briefing. A container ship is a dangerous environment, and the safety and well-being of all crew and passengers is paramount. "Yes, please. Set it up on board next to my cabin and invite the first and second officers." As per custom and tradition, I changed into my dress uniform, put on my cap, and entered the wardroom by turning the latch. "Captain Max, what a terrific impression you make." She smiled vigorously at me. "Miss Seaver?" I asked, taken aback by surprise for a moment. "My ex-husband's name is Toller Seaver. I never changed it after my divorce." Kirsten Toller Seaver had clearly managed to charm my two officers before I arrived, as both could barely contain the smiles on their faces. They were given a safety briefing and told of the prohibitions she could impose on herself aboard ship. Next came the talk about my job as captain of the ship. "So, Kirsten, how did you manage to make this voyage? We are a long way from Bremerhaven." "Oh, that's a wonderful story, Max. I told Dad that I was serious about making this voyage, and by the time I made up my mind, you were already out of port. Then I found out about the storm, and he told me you had to fly here. The only airport I could fly to was Exeter, and here I am. I called him after I left, so there was no stopping me. Your office didn't want to let me in at first, but I told them I could come 12 hours before my flight, and they agreed, especially after I called the Pope's name." I had to clear my throat with a barely perceptible cough and cast a disapproving glance at my officers, who were clearly amused by Miss Kirsten's familiarity. "I'm sure it's been a difficult journey, ma'am, due to the storm and all. I hope our accommodations here will be quite suitable. If I had known you were coming, I would have—" "Oh no, Max, everything is fine as it is. I wouldn't want it any other way, really." I couldn't object to her smile even if I wanted to, and we continued small talk by the board before bowing out and leaving our guest to return to her quarters. "Captain, I'm sure the crew will be pleased. my first mate stated, grinning full mouth. No doubt they will be pleased, I pondered to myself as I climbed the steps to the bridge. A few hours later, Roger Chaffee led us out of the harbor and, spotting Miss Kirsten on the observation deck, winked in his old man way. Female forms always caught his eye. Next time, old boy. And he headed for the starboard side of the skiff. The crew of the Molly Senna numbered 9, and they all hailed from Portugal. They had been aboard for the last few crossings, with some of them filling in for each other when one or the other changed ships or went on another voyage. While the stories of sailors from distant lands are sometimes true and numerous, most container ship crews are of the same nationality. Familiar language and customs make sailing much more harmonious in the long run. A couple of longtime Portuguese sailors ruled the crew with an iron hand when needed, which was rarely. Mostly they vented all their irritation on shore. Besides, working 12 hours a shift and 12 on weekends for 10 weeks left no time for pranks. Nevertheless, once Miss Kirsten was on board, I asked each of my staff to keep an eye on her. Max, it's breathtakingly beautiful here. Is it always like this here? Miss Kirsten asked me a couple days after the trip, standing on the observation deck. Say that the only light in the distance is up there unless the deck lights are on. It was crescent moon that evening, and a backdrop of 1,000,000 stars against a black sky all the way to the horizon set the mood for our excursion. Say, a message was relayed from the bridge about a problem requiring my immediate attention, and I withdrew, almost feeling her lustful gaze on my neck, or so it seemed to me. My staff dines in a cabin that seats 6. Since 2 seats are always taken, we usually dine as a foursome. Kirsten and our fare-paying passenger got a side bench next to the captain's chair. This allowed her to put her elbow up at every meal and almost always be the center of attention. I don't think any of us objected to that. I know my second was fascinated by her as soon as he saw her, so much so that my first officer started teasing him when he thought I couldn't hear, calling him second puppy. It was all within the bounds of shipboard fun, so I didn't say anything. A couple nights later, under the same bright starlight and moonlight, Miss Kirsten and I were back on the lookout bridge, enjoying each other's company and chatting about social life in general. Max, you and your separated wife never had children? She asked, looking out into the Black Sea in front of us. No, we both settled down to a life of adventure. I suppose mine here and hers in the academic world. Besides, she was out of state, and we didn't think adoption would be fair to the child, given my constant absences and her career aspirations. What about you yourself? Is there a young Kirsten among you? She paused briefly and took my hand. Oh yes, I have a daughter. She's all grown up, or at least she thinks she is. She's 20 years old, studying at the university in Würzburg. Very independent, studying physics and a lot of other things I have no idea about. Her name is Marlene, after her great-grandmother, Daddy's mom. We fell silent as she stood and smiled at the mention of her baby. Max, do you mind? She asked, pulling a small flask out of her jacket. Of course not, I replied. Passengers were allowed to bring anything with them, as long as it was carry-on and no frills. I kept a small bottle of cognac in my cabin for special occasions, even though it didn't officially exist. She took a small sip and offered it to me, which I declined. Duty and all that, I reasoned. We finished our evening meeting, and I returned to the bridge to finish my report before lights out. I got back to my quarters around 11 p.m. and, after typing up some literature, fell asleep, setting my alarm for 5 a.m. People tell me that the older you get, the less you sleep at night. This has never been a problem for me. Once I lay down on my pillow, I don't move for 5 or 6 hours until my alarm clock rings. It rang at 2:34 a.m. with a piercing screech like the sound of a mortal wound. It wasn't my alarm clock. It was the voice of a person in extreme agony. By the time I jumped to my feet and grabbed my overcoat, the officer of the watch had already rushed past my quarters and on down the narrow passage. There was a commotion outside, and the door to Miss Kirsten's stateroom appeared to be open. As I approached, a man in pants down to his ankles was lying on the floor, and the duty officer grabbed his shoulder. Jesus, what's going on here? I shouted, half asleep. The crewman lying on the floor was bleeding, and Kirsten was standing nearby with a large knitting needle in her hand. I woke up to him getting into my bed and panicked. My needlework bag was on the table next to me, and I just grabbed what I could. She was already crying when the initial shock passed. I put my arm around her and helped her into the cabin. Kirsten, Please make yourself comfortable while I sort out my things. I handed her a box of tissues and pointed to the small refrigerator in case she wanted something to drink. When I returned, my staff and both Portuguese chiefs were at the ready. There was a large blood stain on the bed, and the perp was being cared for by our first assistant, who was also our doctor at the dispensary. By the time we were done, it was clear what had happened. The Portuguese man had been working on deck during the voyage, fixing rigging, and had used improvised means to break into Kirsten's cabin. Staterooms are locked with a sliding rectangular deadbolt, which can be opened by improvised means devised by one of the crew. The crew is never allowed to go above the third handrail on Deck D of the airlock bridge unless called away on official business. The perpetrator slipped over the railing to the cabins and entered the room. I'm sure he wished he hadn't made the trip. Besides the fact that he was now being treated and then transferred to the hold, Kirsten's spokeshave proved to be a vicious weapon when used. In her panic, it broke, resulting in a bloody wound. I'm sure such wounds can be treated, but until we get to port, bandages and painkillers would be his only salvation. In the meantime, he was doomed to pita, beans, and water in the hold. Doc examined Kirsten for injuries and discharged her, and by the time breakfast was served, none of us were asleep. I asked the engineer to issue padlocks for use in the cabins until we could sort out the locking mechanisms. Sana, what's going to happen to that rascal from the day before? She asked me as we chatted on the observation bridge a few nights later. It was a good question. Being in international waters, the Mali Sena is subject to Panamanian maritime law, and the criminal is extraditable as soon as we dock. But I knew from past experience that it was more complicated than one might think. Miss Kirsten would have to testify to me and my staff as soon as we docked, and then the case would be turned over to the Panamanian consulate in Tampa. Panama will likely advise the U.S. to deport him to Portugal. I'd like to throw him overboard. I took the situation lightly. I think he will eventually be deported back to his country. He will lose his right to work in any port in the U.S. and Europe. More importantly, how are you doing? She squeezed my hand and smiled. Things are good now, although the first couple nights were rough, especially after the adrenaline subsided. Dad taught my sister and I how to cope when we were little, and it wasn't the first time for me. I'd broken a boy's arm when I was at university, although this incident was a bit more serious. Seriously, I'm coping. What about the intruder's injuries? Well, there was that too. Doc treated the man's wounds as best he could, but the spoke had done considerable damage. By dressing the wound, he would be able to receive proper medical attention once we reached port, but that was still 4 days away. Until then, he would get fresh bandages and 30 minutes of fresh air a day. I don't think there was a soul on board who sympathized with him, including his own Portuguese shipmates. The next 4 days passed without incident, although I spent most of my free time in Kirsten's company. By the time we entered the shipping channel off Charleston Harbor, I think she knew pretty much everything about me except some intimate preferences. Some things just aren't talked about with a lady. We pulled in behind the battery, and the harbor master met us with 2 tugs to take us to Wando Welch, the terminal on the Mount Pleasant side. 2 shorts and a long whistle as we passed East Bay let Satch know I was ready to go to sea. I hadn't called Tammy, so I didn't know if she came back and heard it or not. After going through customs and giving a statement, the health department officers came aboard and took custody of the crewmen in the hold, and I handed the helm over to my engineer before setting sail. Captain, come on. My fiancé and I will drop you off downtown. My first officer had already loaded Kirsten's suitcases onto the cart and headed for his wife's car. Kirsten was staying at the Spectator Hotel on State Street, just south of Market Square for a few days until she traveled to Washington, D.C. and on to New York City. From there, she intended to fly home. When we dropped her off, the bellboy busied himself with her bags, and she hugged me tightly, reminding me how hard it had been for her that evening on the deck a few nights before. Max, when you get your personal business sorted out, don't forget that you promised to give me a royal tour of the Holy City. She reminded me of that with a quick kiss. With those words, I set off and they drove me home, this time without white roses. The house looked exactly the same as it had 10 weeks ago. I lifted the deadbolt on the iron gate, cursing myself for not having time to finish repairing the weld, and walked across the yard to the back door. When I entered the house, it was as quiet as it had been a few weeks ago. There were a few signs that the Border Patrol had come by the house before I left, but otherwise nothing had changed. When Tammy left for Vancouver, I decided to rent out another room to a second student, a family friend of a girl who was already living with us. Both of them were quiet and peaceful souls, kept to themselves and carefully policed, so I often didn't know if they were even around. One of the girls had left a couple of messages next to the phone counter, and looking through them and the stack of junk mail next to it, I saw that Tammy had forwarded a couple of business letters, and in the stack was a note from Mrs. Sophie Pryor. Mr. Bunyan, please call me when you get back in town. Miss Pryor. Quick and precise with a phone number. I set it aside and carried the stack of laundry to the back room before heading upstairs to shower and change in anticipation of a quick bite at Henry's and a pint or two of beer. I heard your rust bucket came early, Max, Such exclaimed, placing a cold IPA in front of me. Last time we talked, you were thinking about moving into a nursing home. I'd turned 52 a few months before, and Such never let me forget it. Never mind that he was only a year younger than me. Never mind that for me it was just another year on the right side of the green grass. I was as healthy as a horse, if, indeed, horses are the standard of health. I was still as manly, only with a slight tinge of gray on my temples, and I still had all my teeth. I'm thinking of opening a dormitory for young female students, 3 to a room. Considering I already had 2 female students living in my pastel house, Such only shook his head and chuckled at the thought. One of the female students sitting at a nearby table overheard the conversation and approached me, asking if I was serious since she was looking for a place to live for the summer session that would begin in a few months. I handed her a business card with the numbers of the 2 boarders I already had and told her to call them. They handle all the new ones. Such just looked at me, and we both burst into laughter. Not bad for an old geezer who should be retired. A few days passed when I remembered the short note from Sophie Pryor and decided to give her a call. Max, thank you for taking my call. I know you are a busy man, and with everything going on, I wasn't sure if you would want to talk. Sophie answered on the second ring. Sophie, I always have time to talk to you, you know that. Can I assume this has something to do with your husband and my wife? I asked, getting straight to the point. I suppose so, yes. Thomas has had cats for years. I just didn't expect Tammy to fall so in love with him. I would have called you sooner, but every time I went back to the Battery, you were off to sea again. This time, I left a note for that nice girl who took up residence in one of your rooms. She was so kind. Yes, they are both fine young ladies. Yes, they are. And as for Thomas, I kicked him out of the house in Charleston, albeit with a black eye to match his black traveling bag. She grinned. He's staying at our apartment on King Street, though he seems to spend as much time in Vancouver as he does here. According to his secretary, he attends scientific conferences. Horse manure, I say. I thought you should know, since Tammy, according to her staff, has been living in Vancouver for the past 6 months. I really don't know what the hell she could find in him. Nevertheless, Max, she called me about a month ago and asked if I could influence Thomas by apologizing for a hurricane of tears for 10 minutes. Apparently, she was tired of his harassment and he didn't want to go off on his own. I got the impression that he tried several times to stay with her, but she wouldn't budge. I realize that doesn't justify her staying with Jim Dahlberg for months, but at least she came to her senses about Thomas. I've taken care of him on my end. As soon as those words left her lips, my heart sank, and I chased myself away for not noticing it sooner. Jim Dahlberg is a visiting professor of humanities from Kingston University in Ontario who has a long association with Vancouver. We've had dinner with him several times over the past couple years and even invited him to visit. Perhaps it was the long, pregnant pause that had Sophie worried. Max, you didn't know about Jim? No, Sophie, it was news to me. Oh my God, I thought it was all figured out after Tammy left for Vancouver. Do you know how long this has been going on? Max, I really don't know. You know, people talk and stuff. I heard rumors as far back as last year. All I know is that it was still going on when she called me, or at least she was living in the same apartment. I checked with the university for contact information for both her and Jim, and it's the same. Sophie, thank you for telling me about this. Seriously, it means a lot to me with everything else that's going on. I promised Sophie to stay in touch and ended the conversation. Sophie, you're a sly old bird for throwing her under the bus like that, I muttered to myself. In addition to the revelations about Tammy and Dahlberg, I also learned that Thomas Pryor was essentially a kept man, since he owned none of the jointly acquired assets with Sophie and had no claim to her wealth or property since she had inherited most of it before they were married. The two of them lived on Battery Row, the most prestigious address in the city. She also owned an apartment on King Street, and she told me that she had decided to move his belongings out and change the locks on his lack. Poor Toad. 6 months of separation just got the seal of approval, and while I should have been seething at this revelation, I took it surprisingly calmly. Sure, I was mad as hell at the deception, but it didn't seem strange anymore. It made sense from an adulterer's point of view, since Jim Dahlberg was easy prey for any serious suitor. Thomas was just a damn toad, there was no other way to call it, and I still couldn't understand it. There had to be more to the story. Anyway, I looked at the ring on my finger, and without a moment's hesitation, I took it off and put it in the candy dish on the mantel. "Well, hello, my sea captain," she said when I answered. I hadn't thought of Kirsten since my buddy and I dropped her off at the Spectator upon arrival in port. "Good day to you too, Miss Kirsten. Max, how are things in your family since your return?" "Pretty much the same, I must say. I'm living alone again," I replied, not bothering to elaborate further. She was silent for a moment and then turned to me. "I need a companion for dinner tonight, Max. I hope you'll be polite and spend the evening with me. I made a reservation for 2 at the Oak restaurant. It came highly recommended. And then we can walk down the street. It's such a lovely evening. It's much nicer here than in snowy Bremerhaven." She clung to me tightly and pulled me with her. "So, you can pick me up in the lobby downstairs at 7 o'clock tonight." I don't know if I agreed, but when we finished talking, I found myself in the upstairs closet looking for a tweed jacket I really liked and headed for the shower. If I was thinking about Tammy, her thoughts were clouded by distance and visions of Jim Dahlberg. I know I wasn't thinking exactly as I should have, but the elixir, if it didn't work, certainly intoxicated me enough to eat dinner and go for a walk. I got ready and, half sitting up, headed down Anson Street. At 6:55, I was sitting at the Spectator bar, sipping bourbon from a tumbler, waiting for Miss Toller's Seaver. When I looked up, she was standing there. "Jesus," I whispered, trying not to breathe. She only smiled and gave me a European hug. "Miss Kirsten, you look stunning as always." "Captain Bunyan, you are a man of fine words. What woman would tire of being called stunning?" After finishing her bourbon, Kirsten threw a shawl over her shoulders and we caught a pedicab out front to take us to Broad Street and the Oak restaurant. We arrived and the maitre d' escorted us to our reserved seats in a cozy alcove on the second floor. "And the hostess?" she asked over dessert. I hadn't said anything about my discovery a couple days before, but we were comfortable enough with each other that I could tell it was probably the proverbial nail in the coffin lid as far as her current living arrangements were concerned. "There's no hope of reconciliation?" she asked with unperturbed seriousness. "I don't see how that's even possible." It was as if a spark had been lit in her eyes. "Is that why you don't wear the ring?" I'd completely forgotten about it, but she was right. It was over between me and Tammy. "Let me tuck in and we'll walk around town," I suggested. We walked out onto Broad Street. Kirsten took off her heeled shoes and put on a pair of canvas walkers, then took my hand in hers and we walked through the maze of antique stores and galleries. It was a cool, early March evening, comfortable enough for her coat and my tweed. An hour or so later, I caught another pedicab and the two of us headed to Henry's house for another drink. And frankly, I felt like showing off to Such with Kirsten in my arms for a little massage. "You know how I usually do, dude. And white wine for my escort," I told him at the bar with a chuckle. It was a weekday, so there weren't as many vendors at the meat market as there were on the weekend. "It's nice to see Max finally realize he needs an escort." He smiled and muttered, "Tammy?" and looked at me angrily. I only shook my head slightly. Kirsten smiled and squeezed my hand tighter, which amused Such even more. She was like honey to the bees. At one point, a few of the regulars came up to her to inspect the merchandise. It wasn't nice of me to lead her into Henry's, but at that point I didn't care. We were having a good time and that was my comfort zone. Perhaps we'd each had a little too much to drink, and inhibitions fell to the level of a basement sale as the two adults continued to gaze lovingly into each other's eyes. "My apartment?" I asked. "Yes, please come in," she hastily replied. The house was quiet as I turned the deadbolt and we entered the living room. There were 2 female students living on the 3rd floor and I rarely saw them in the evenings, which was probably a good thing since I hadn't mentioned them to Kirsten. We jumped on the bed, or rather laid down on it. And thanks to the alcohol and the late hour, we soon both fell into a serene slumber. When I woke up, it was close to noon and Kirsten was already up. I didn't hear her when I went to take a shower, and when I returned to the bedroom, she was gone. I threw on a robe and t-shirt and headed downstairs to the kitchen. "Good morning, Captain Max," Kirsten exclaimed cheerfully, sitting down at the table with two of my students. Both had ingratiating smiles on their faces as they buttered their muffins. "Sam, the girls and I were just enjoying a nice chat after they kindly picked up my things this morning." She nodded toward her clothes on the empty chair. "That was very nice of them," I said, trying to suppress a smile as I poured a fresh cup of coffee. The two girls withdrew, giggling, and Kirsten put on a contrived arrogance. "Well, I just forgot to tell you that I dismantled the board on the top floor of the house." She made one of those faces women make when a man realizes he's screwed up, but not by much. "It's okay. They're nice young ladies. I think one of them is very much in love with you, Max. Don't break her heart too much." She smiled. We enjoyed breakfast, and after cleaning up, I gave her a tour of the market square, and by lunchtime we were sitting in the patio cafe. "Max, so what are you going to do with your wife at this point? I know you said it's over, but does she know that?" It was a fair question that I really didn't have time for. Sure enough, there was Tammy, then Thomas, Sophie, and White Mandingo Jim Dahlberg. She lied to me when she had the chance to come clean and put it behind her. I don't see a way back, especially now. And no, it's not about what we did, Kirsten. It's about what she did and what she continues to do. So she didn't break up with him? Obviously not. I looked down the street with its throng of passers-by. I knew even then that if Tammy had come clean, told me everything, and apologized that rainy day in the kitchen, I would have forgiven her, even if the affair with Dahlberg was a thing of the past. That's how much I loved her. I would never have gotten into bed with Kirsten or even thought about it. But now, it was all in the past. I knew what I had to do. The next day, Kirsten was leaving for Washington, D.C., and then New York for a couple weeks. The attraction between us was electric, and I had almost put things aside to join her, but I knew there were still a few unpleasant things to deal with. At the end of the day, the two of us took a water cab tour of the harbor and river, and I walked her back to the Spectator. "Are you sure you won't go up, Max?" We discussed what I needed to do, and I declined the offer, but not before we hugged and whispered promises to each other. With those words, I turned back toward the market and the office on King Street. When I landed and picked up my bag, it was overcast and drizzling rain. The hotel shuttle bus took me to my reserved room, and after getting settled in, I was soon sitting at the bar, stirring a bourbon with my fingers and watching the CBS drone go on and on about some First Nation-related nonsense I knew nothing about. A pretty waitress came over and offered to pour me another, but I had things to do, so I defiantly waved her off. "West of 10th, near the university, please," I said to the driver as he pulled up behind me. I checked the GPS reading on her phone and realized she was there, or at least electronically. The cliché envelope rested in my lap as the driver made his way through the busy streets, avoiding one or two pedestrians along the way. We stopped in front of a 4-story apartment building, and I peered up at the top floor, far to the left, wondering if the god of hellfire had placed enough obstacles in my path. I was about to say to hell with this, and felt tempted to drop the envelope in the mailbox on the next street over and go home. "Would you like me to wait, sir?" the courteous driver asked, as if he had read my train of thought. "No, go ahead and drive. I don't know how long I'll be." After I paid, he handed me his card in case I needed him. I walked up the stairs out onto the landing and looked at the neat entrance at the end of the hallway with a couple of potted plants standing guard by the door. The frame was gilded with the Old English numerals 404A. I was still putting on my leather driving gloves when I knocked on the door, and a second time. "God damn it, Pryor, you goddamn shit!" shouted the man as I heard him walk to the door. He opened it and froze, catching his breath and widening his eyes in surprise when he saw me. "Max, I thought—" 30 years of working in mechanical engineering, laying gangways and decks, pulling pipes and motors hadn't left me soft even at 52. A left jab, and Jim Dahlberg collapsed to the floor of the apartment foyer. Finished, I stepped over him and sat down in the living room when Tammy finally ran into the hallway, still dripping water from the shower I'd interrupted. She stood in the hallway and stared at me, unable or unwilling to speak. I nodded toward her unconscious admirer lying in the foyer. Have a seat, Tammy. There's something we need to discuss. I pointed to the couch, rose to close the front door, and stepped over the son of a bitch. Why didn't you just go back inside, Tammy? I suppose I shouldn't have to answer that question since you clearly weren't going to give it up. Dahlberg hissed and Tammy rushed over to help. Max, that just couldn't be done. What the hell were you thinking? I looked at her in bewilderment. I was thinking about all the times he entertained you in my bed or his or wherever. That's what I was thinking about. Say, I tossed the yellow envelope onto the coffee table and saw her eyes widen. Max, it's not what you're thinking. I interrupted her and walked down the hallway to the apartment's only bedroom, where I saw freshly laundered sheets and their clothes strewn across the floor. Tammy helped Dahlberg to the couch where he lay in a daze. I've honestly been giving you, Tammy, half of my savings for the last 12 years since we started living officially. We each have our own pensions, so there's no need to make a big deal out of it. I had my own house before you came along, and you have your own bungalow in West Ashley. I'm going to keep it simple. Just sign the papers and I'll deliver your things across town. She looked as if a reaper had just burst into the house and wiped out the top floor in a bloodbath, and Dahlberg sat there like a Canadian chipmunk with a swollen jaw. I'd say, Max, let me come home to talk and see if we can get past this, please. I just shook my head. Tammy, I almost fell in love with you when I first saw you, and honestly, I still do. But you tore my heart out with this. I'll never be able to trust you again. How the hell could I? It could have been 30 people, not 3. I'll never know, and what does it matter? No, you killed us, and I don't see a way back. You can't say that, Max, you can't. I looked at her standing in her clothes in the apartment a continent away and nodded to Jim Dahlberg before shaking my head. Jesus X. Don't go back to the house, Tammy. There won't be a single thing there for you. The girls will know you're persona non grata on Anson Street. Just sign the papers and live the life you've lived for so long in my absence. I turned around so she wouldn't see the tears in my eyes and walked out. When I reached the stairs, I looked back. She was standing in the doorway crying. I continued on my way and started walking towards the center of town, hoping to escape before the local police caught me for impersonating a criminal. The next day was a long, quiet flight back to Charleston. The local police never showed up at the hotel, and I left Vancouver with a confused soul and an even less certain future. No matter what I told myself, and no matter what she did, I still loved Tammy, despite my almost frenzied attraction and desire for Kirsten. Despite everything, I knew that a 20-year relationship with my wife and lover had just slammed the door behind me. There was another pint of beer left in the brewery as I looked over the figures in the papers in front of me. I'll be 30 years old in 3 months, and if I continue to serve, I'll be doing it for the bank, not to increase my pension. Healthcare isn't going to get any better with an 80-20th ratio, so if I were a practical man, I would retire and live like a city gentleman. But apparently I wasn't that practical. My love of the sea ultimately meant more, and I stayed with the company for another year. Max, I'm sorry to hear the bad news about you and Tammy. You've come a long way. Such was as sincere as it was even possible to be. He'd tried to do it 3 times himself, but never could. Yeah, but it's okay. We'll both get over it and move on. I was lying. It really wasn't that fine. When I got back from Vancouver, I painfully packed all of Tammy's things and had the truck deliver them to her sister's bungalow as I had promised. Sea captains don't cry, so the instructions said. I was stoic and determined right up to the point where I had to unload her crates and pack the contents. And then I stopped. These stupid bastards who imagine that burning a bitch is the great purification of the soul have never loved a woman the way they do now. They talk about it, about getting their pound of flesh, but none of them have ever stood on the ashes of what they created. I stood in the empty room and cried like a damn child. 6 feet 2 inches and 200 pounds of empty shell. Then I went to Henry's and got drunk. That drinking got me out of my hangover, and I started putting myself out to the fullest again. And I was still 2 weeks away from a new load. Was still 2 weeks away. The Molly Sane ship was on the road again and was 3 days away from Charleston. And I was lying in my bunk looking at the ship's news and personal mail. Kirsten sent me letters from time to time, asking how I was feeling. One evening when she was in New York, we discussed the confrontation at length over the phone. It's not easy to go from one woman to another. Indeed, I'd say it's impossible. In our case, there was a magnetism between Kirsten and me that neither of us could explain, and she realized that my heart was still in the clutches of another woman and, whether by calculation or oversight, was bypassing us. This only increased my affection for her. As the weeks passed and still no word from Tammy about the signing of the papers, after a short passage from Rotterdam, we pulled into the dock at Bremerhaven, where we spent 3 days unloading and loading. Finding myself safe, I gave the crew liberty for 24 hours and, taking watch, went ashore to do my own searching. The cab stopped in front of a stuccoed 3-story mansion in Helgelanderstrasse, and as I drove off, I looked at the house. A fleeting face lingered briefly at the curtain, and when I pressed the bell, the door swung open before I could release my finger. "Max, I've been waiting," she whispered and jumped into my arms, nuzzling her face into my throat. At that moment, I had no words. I just savored the lust and desire I felt for her. Her lips pressed against mine, and our embrace remained in the foyer with the door to the street open. "Come in, please," her throaty voice rang out, full of desire. Somehow we made our way into the living room. She led me into the kitchen, poured a couple shots of cognac, and we toasted to my long-awaited arrival. Once seated, I looked around her house. It was cozily furnished with European antiques and had an air of old conservative comfort. On the mantel hung family photos, one of her daughter, strikingly beautiful, and another of Dennis Toller with his late wife and mother, Kirsten. Dad lives with me and has occupied the 3rd floor since Mom died 4 years ago. My sister Lydia lives on the 2nd floor when she's in town, but now that she's found a new beau, it's happening less and less often. She smiled somewhat symbolically. And of course, Marlene and I. We sat for a while before heading out to dinner, and the more I admired her, the more I felt like a young man who had just discovered the true love of his life. If I were a mere young man, I would have believed it, but as someone who had lived a life of more than vague feelings, I knew the complexities as well as Kirsten. Max, when my ex-husband left me, it took me a long time to sign the papers, almost 2 years, and he was very patient, even though he had another woman in New York on his hands who wanted to marry him. To spite him, I slept with 3 men and 1 woman, mostly out of revenge, though I secretly hoped he would come back to me. He never did, so Lydia convinced me to sign. And then he wanted to come back. By then, I didn't want to break up with him anymore. "He was a fool," I said seriously. "Yeah, so was your wife since she left you the way she did. Her divorce was a very different matter from my own. They both let their marriage fall apart until they were in the arms of strangers, and the accusations were common knowledge. Had I known of the danger, I would have acted quickly to prevent it in Tammy's case, but in this matter, hindsight is as valuable as ignorance. It didn't matter whether Tammy signed the contract or not. In the end, the court would decide, and of course I convinced myself that I would never rush into a new relationship." The slowly rotating ceiling fan above us continued to move as we lay there, momentarily speechless, but not for long. "Max, where did you say you studied engineering? I think it was in Castine? In New England?" "Yes, at the Maine Maritime Academy in Castine, Maine. A beautiful place on the coast of Maine. I'll show it to you on a map when we get a chance. I'd like to do more than that. I want to see Maine. Dad says it's a lot like Norway, but with a rockier and wilder coastline. Sounds like an amazing place. Maybe you could take me there someday?" I nodded and smiled, both outwardly and inwardly. I couldn't imagine a better time than spending a vacation with this woman in a cottage on the outskirts of Maine. When I was a young man, I had always dreamed of returning to Castine or even Venalhaven Island. It was a romantic idea, but not always practical, so over the years I kept putting it off for later. I have many fond memories of this place. It's lovely in the summer, although it can get a bit gloomy in the winter months. Maybe on one of my days off we can go there. There was a sparkle in her eyes again. In the morning, Kirsten made me an old-fashioned German breakfast. Well, old-fashioned for my taste. It was scrambled eggs and ham on pumpernickel, black coffee, and a muffin. "Dennis isn't here?" I asked, noticing his absence. "Oh no, he's in Hamburg for a conference." I felt some relief knowing he wasn't here. She only grinned as if she had read my mind. "Where are you going next?" she asked. "Unfortunately, I'll have to go through Suez. Dad says the captains hate it, most of them." He's right. We could sit in Port Said for a very long time if we get on the wrong side. The good thing is that I'll finish my rotation in Bremerhaven in 5 weeks. That will give me a 6-week break in my rotation at the very beginning of the summer. I imagined the wheels turning in her head, but right now I needed to finish my work and get back to the ship. We had a long goodbye, and she drove me to the river dock where I changed into a watch officer. I watched as 4 men, each with a black duffel bag and a gray stocking cap on their heads, boarded the Molly Senna at the starboard lock. They kept mostly to themselves, securing their rigging in the forward hold and simply observing the situation on deck. They were PMSC riggers, mercenaries from a private maritime security company that several shipping companies have hired to work in the Indian Ocean because of Islamic pirates rampaging through the Gulf of Aden, the Mozambique Channel, and even off the coast of Madagascar near Saint-Denis on Réunion. We were carrying cargo destined for Athens, South Africa, and Argentina, or I would have avoided the route through the Horn of Africa at almost any cost. Captain, Port Said has authorized us direct entry into the channel once we pass Zakros, my first mate reported. This was good news. It meant that most of the trade flow was behind us and we would be allowed into the canal without any waiting. As we passed Port Said, the riggers became much more active, taking up watch posts as we moved south. It wasn't just Indian Ocean pirates that were a concern. Radical Islamists on both coasts were a constant thorn in the side, although the Egyptian army kept control of most of the territory. We entered the Red Sea without incident and continued south, approaching the Somali coast, at which point the bridge watch alerted our riggers. On the port side, a small trawler was launching a pair of outboard boats with crews of 5 or 6 men on each, maybe more if you went down the bow. "Captain, we're being fired upon," "Aight," shouted my second. We heard a rapid succession of pings hitting the left wall of the bridge before a pair of riggers opened fire on one of the approaching outboard ships. The crew had already left the deck and were out of danger. Only myself and the 5 officers were on deck along with the riggers. And then all hell broke loose when a rocket flew past the bridge, missing the first stack of containers 10 feet below us. "Jesus Christ, retreat behind the bulkhead!" I shouted to them to take up position behind the protective bulkhead we'd set up on the bridge just for such occasions. It was not a safe room, but rather a reflective barrier. The riggers returned fire at the trawler with large caliber machine guns, firing several bursts of .50 caliber. As a rocket flew past us, one of the riggers picked up what I was later told was a Gustav M3 Moz and fired his rocket just before a second rocket from the trawler hit the port side stern and shook us all the way to the bow, although it was not a serious hit. The trawler, on the other hand, took a direct hit on one of the fuel tanks and with a mighty fireball broke the rig in two. At this point, all 4 riggers opened fire on the 2 outboard motors, and within seconds both vessels were enveloped in black smoke and flames. We saw the terrorists jump out of the boat into the warm water, perhaps hoping we would save their sorry asses from certain death at sea, either drowning or becoming fodder in a shark's belly. The speed of the Molly Senna was 23 knots. There was no way I was going to slow down and take the time to slowly circle around to pick up these fools who were just trying to bank us with missiles and guns. We were in international waters, and I was under the authority of the Department of the Interior. I was the law. We had no obligation except to notify the nearest friendly maritime authorities. As long as we remained seaworthy, we did not stop for a moment until we reached Cape Town. "Captain, I have one man suffering a superficial wound to his left arm. He is being treated. 2 of my men have collected all the brass they can find, and with your permission we will regroup and prepare for the remainder of the voyage. We're not out of range yet." He was a young man, in his 30s, and reminded me of a former Navy instructor I'd gone to school with. And he was right. We had a long way to go. At this point, the adrenaline was starting to wear off, and I needed to sit down. It was one thing to anticipate it, quite another to experience it for real. That's when I decided enough was enough. 2 rotations in a row with serious incidents. The one with Kirsten, and now this one. The damn terrorist pirate attack. I decided to let the office know I'd changed my mind about staying late. In the meantime, I sat my first and second officers down, put 3 tumblers on the board, and poured 3 fingers of brandy into each. "Here's to the high seas, and another $1 earned, boys." We toasted, drank, and did it one more time before I called the office by satellite. 3 weeks later, we were crossing the English Channel, heading for Bremerhaven. The PMSC riggers disembarked in Cape Town and flew to Indonesia for another assignment. We had only minimal damage to the stern rail and 2 damaged containers. All in all ended well. My Portuguese crew didn't think so. One of the petty officers said he thought more than half the crew were going to quit as soon as they got ashore. "They're not soldiers," he said. "Indeed, what are they?" I thought, opening the email my lawyer had sent me a few days earlier. The plane landed in Charleston, on the second leg of the flight from Frankfurt am Main via Dulles, and I took an Uber to get to the peninsula. My old neighbor, Mr. Shields, had planted a fresh row of roses along his windows, and they were in full bloom. "Your girls are a great help to me, Mr. Bunyan. Good girls, both of them." He said this when I brought the baked goods he loved so much from Kaminsky's store. "Two of the best." I smiled and turned to the iron gate. The foreman had soldered the deadbolt, and everything was secure again while I trimmed the old flowers on the path to the back door. With a cup of fresh coffee, I began to review the letter I'd received from the lawyer a few days ago. Tammy still hadn't signed the papers, insisting on a so-called second chance, and sitting here in the house. She'd moved back to Charleston a couple weeks ago. Apparently her months-long treacherous swoon had come to an end. Anger made steam rise from my shirt collar as I reread her platitudes for the 10th time, and I immediately ruled out any meeting in this house. I simply couldn't imagine any circumstances that could make us forget about her infidelity, and now that my affair with Kirsten had muddied the waters even further, it seemed ridiculous to me to even try. Nevertheless, I called my lawyer to arrange a meeting on neutral ground. I wanted kebabs, and he made an appointment at Bessinger's, a restaurant just west of Ashley's. I filled a styrofoam container with 4 pockets with stacks of draft port, ribs, and fixings, then took one of the outdoor picnic tables and asked the waitress to bring a pitcher of sweet tea. The meeting could be unpleasant, but I was going to eat like a Southern king. A few minutes later, Tammy joined me with a much smaller portion. I had to give it to her. "Tammy, this is your meeting," I muttered, bringing the bun and sauce to my mouth. She didn't waste any time. "I want to go home, Max. I want to go home and try to get back what I stupidly and recklessly threw away. I know it won't be easy for me, but I'm asking you to give me that chance." She didn't realize it, but that meant she wanted to go back to that rainy day on Anson Street and redo everything. I wasn't okay with that. I reached for the plastic bottle of spicy Carolina sauce and spread it on my fork. "Remember the Christmas party last year? The one where Jim Dahlberg wrapped mistletoe around every woman he could get near, including you? That asshole knew where the bathroom was on the second floor. Hell, he even knew where anything was, didn't he?" I took a bite from my pulled pork sandwich and savored its flavor for a while, waiting for her response. I know it sounds frivolous, but she had already broken my heart and I had shed all the tears I was going to shed. I had other things I wanted to know. "I want to know about that damn toad, Thomas Pryor." At this point, Tammy was on the verge of tears, but she pressed her lips together. "Thomas blackmailed me," she said in a quiet tone. "He caught Jim and I together one afternoon and threatened to go to you. He videotaped us on his phone. Jesus, Max, I didn't want any of this. Everything was spinning out of control, and then there was Thomas. I wasn't thinking straight, and when Jim told me to get away from it all to Vancouver, I thought that was the end of it. I didn't know Jim would show up. I was weak around him. He has that effect on women, I don't know what it is. I know what it is, Tammy. It's a cheating wife, a wife who's been cheating on me for a year and a half. That was even before that Christmas, wasn't it?" She didn't need to answer. I could see it in her face. I half expected blackmail. I convinced myself that it would have to be dealt with later. "Tammy, I don't see that anything has changed from the one in Vancouver. Basically, that meeting was a waste of time as far as I'm concerned. Max, we've been together for over 20 years. You can't just drop everything like that. Go out and have an affair. God knows you drool all the time. I'll give you a free card, hell. I'll give you a dozen of them, even if I hate every minute of it, but we can't give it all up." She was already crying, but she still didn't understand. I'd give her all the Anson Street goodies if she'd just come clean and get it over with. Instead, she cuckolded me for another 6 months. That's what I called her. She knew what it meant to her ego. A cuckold with her own damn stud, having fun with him right in her own bed. Jesus Christ. She didn't deny anything, just sat there crying, realizing the futility of it all. "Tell me, Tammy, why did you start a relationship with him in the first place? You know the old saying, curiosity killed the cat. The others were telling the truth about him, that he hung like a horse and was twice as talented. I figured I could do one time and get rid of the itch. To hell with it, Tammy. I could have found 100 desirable women over the years and kept one in each port, but I didn't. I had no way of knowing how many there were or how many there would be in the future. The old saying that absence makes the heart grow merrier seemed nonsensical in this case. We looked at each other, realizing that this was the end, and I had no more appetite, only sadness after 20 years. Maybe she was hoping I'd be around again when she sorted out the desires in her head. Maybe she had already sorted it out, but I couldn't trust her. I couldn't share any of my plans with her except to know that I wouldn't be there for her anymore. And that was where our paths parted. She didn't know about Kirsten, and I didn't see the need to tell her. What I did to Kirsten happened after I took the ring off, realizing it was over. Maximilian's Gold IPA is on deck, he announced into the microphone. Sutch walked over to him. Did the fat lady sing her song? I nodded and sipped off a thin layer of foam. Not only did the fat lady sing, but she brought the curtain down. Tammy signed the papers and we settled things so that the final judgment would take effect in a few months. Dahlberg left for Toronto. There were rumors that he was staying as far away from Tammy as possible, but I tried to ignore them. Sophie Pryor had divorced her toad, and Thomas had moved into a townhouse in North Charleston, not the address he'd hoped for. Satch, have you ever thought about dropping everything and going to that island you've always dreamed of? Dude, I think about it from time to time, but look at me. I have my own apartment with all these moms that come here. I'm big and black and handsome, and I have my boys to play with. He pointed to his saxophone in the corner. Then he flashed me his trademark white-hot smile. I'll get to that someday. After buying a mug each for the regulars, we headed out the door and toward Anson Street, where a light haze of rain hung in the air. I pressed the bell on the doorframe of a townhouse on Helgolanderstrasse and heard footsteps approaching. When the door opened, a young woman, a 20-year-old version of Kirsten herself, stood in front of me. You must be Marlene, I said, extending my hand. Yes, Mr. Banyan. My mom told me you'd be stopping by today. Please come in. Please, call me Max. I followed her into the parlor, leaving my bag in the foyer while she told me to make myself comfortable. Having studied girls her age for over 25 years now, I was used to varying degrees of beauty and not so beauty. Marlene was in a class of her own. Any man who charmed this girl had to thank his lucky stars for such good fortune. Mother said she would be here for dinner. She put the tea in front of me and sat across from me. She's been very excited for days now. Not a few moments later, the front door swung open and Kirsten walked into the room, seeing the two of us, followed shortly by her father, Dennis. She rushed over to me and gave me a hug and a kiss, and Dennis shook my hand. Lunch was enjoyable, and after the table was cleared, Kirsten and I sat in the yard and enjoyed the moment before putting our bags in the trunk of her car. Marlene was going to drive us to Frankfurt am Main and then continue on to Würzburg. The next morning at 10 o'clock, we rented a car and drove to Castine on Penobscot Bay. Our flight arrived in Bangor, and we had several hours of driving ahead of us. I had promised Kirsten months ago to take her to coastal Maine, and now, with fall colors modeling around us and mild weather, it was the perfect time of year. I had rented a cottage for the week, and all we had to do was get groceries and get comfortable, if nothing else. Mr. Banyan, may I call you Max? The distinguished gentleman asked. Of course, I'll address you as Dean Gardner if you don't mind. We both chuckled as the dean of the Maine Maritime Academy escorted me into his office overlooking Castine Bay. It happened by chance when I ran into an old acquaintance from MMA who ran a cruise ship out of Fort Lauderdale. He called a friend. The friend called another friend, who in turn asked the dean to call me. This was to discuss the final terms of a contract to teach engineering as an adjunct professor at the academy. We came to an agreement, and a short time later I was rushing toward a rented cottage near Dice Head Lighthouse. You got it, didn't you? Kirsten exclaimed when she saw my shining face. Of course I got it. You didn't doubt it, did you? I replied, picking her up in my arms and carrying her to the soft bed. The next day we had a decision to make, where we wanted to live and for how long. I still had Anson Street. She had an apartment in her family home in Bremerhaven, and I now had a part-time job here in Castine. We were sitting on the shore of Dice Head, looking across the bay at Islesboro, when Kirsten asked, "Why not there?" "Well, the ferry takes you across the bay, not here. I'd have to take the ferry in Lincolnville and then drive over an hour to get to Castine. I'll have to have my own boat to get here." "You're the captain, Max. It's pretty simple, isn't it?" She looked at me with one of those expressions women make when they can't believe how stupid we men are about some things. Later that evening, I searched the internet for used boats and found some great options, one in particular. It was a former lobster fishing boat that had been converted into a small pleasure craft for an elderly couple on Venalhaven. It had a rebuilt Cummins diesel engine with only 200 hours on it. A couple days later, after becoming $20,000 poorer, she was mine. Kirsten found a house. It was a white boardwalk cottage overlooking Castine, and within walking distance of the marina where I could get a parking space at a reasonable price. The house wasn't cheap, but it had a garden and a tavern a mile or so south. I put down a deposit and the owner let me rent it until we closed. We became official residents of Islesboro. I was assigned a 6-week freshman pipe fitting class and supervised the work on the TS State of Maine, an MMA training vessel moored in the harbor. I needed to finish the job before Thanksgiving and the holidays, so Kirsten and I made plans to drive to Charleston and then fly to Germany. As we walked from the market, Anson Street was full of sightseers and students crowding the stores and establishments. Sutch had recommended his girlfriend to handle the property affairs of the house in my absence, and the girls in the house were quite reliable. So I turned the key in the lock and entered the house as if I had never left. I remembered to warn the girls that they could use the downstairs as they saw fit, as long as they kept an eye on it, which they did. It had been a long day of traveling, so after ordering Chinese takeout and drinking a bottle of wine, we headed out for the night, making slow, tender love in bed. When we got up, only one of the girls was in the house. The other 3 had gone home for the vacations, and we invited her to celebrate Thanksgiving at Caroline's, a swanky restaurant in the East Bay neighborhood, along with Sutch and a couple other old jerks. Everyone had a great time, and after we invited everyone over to her house, Sutch and I were relaxing on the front steps enjoying a good cigar and a bottle of excellent bourbon. "Dude, you know I've been on my guard working for you. You know that your ex-missus gave the college hell, accused her boss of harassment, and then several other faculty members came forward with accusations against him? It was in the papers. I think he's in deep shit and people are saying he'll either resign or be fired." "That damn toad Pryor." I laughed, feeling the pleasant taste of bourbon on my lips. "Yeah, but things aren't going well for your old missus either, you know. She's been on a bender for months now, ever since you two broke up. A week ago, she came to my place, got drunk, asked about you, and left a couple of hours later with some horny guy. That was her problem, Sutch. She likes weirdness too much. Hell, I'm surprised she didn't suggest it to you, too." He looked at me a little oddly, and then I realized what he was talking about. "She did offer it, didn't she? Jesus Christ." I laughed. "You did it with her?" "No, dude, you and I have known each other too long to do shit like that. I mean, she's nice and all, and if she was someone else's bitch, I'd straighten her out on day one. But she's heavy baggage, and as long as you're alive, she's still your wife, even if you get divorced." "What about that beautiful woman you're with now? Are you and Kirsten going to get married or what?" Maybe it was the bourbon, or the wistful thoughts hovering in the air and puffs of cigar smoke. I would marry Kirsten if we were both in a position to get married, but so far neither of us was going to go down that path. We were both divorced adults who loved what we were doing, and life was great. Why mess it up? Sutch, I don't know. Maybe someday it will happen, but for now I'm playing life here in Maine and even in Europe. It's going well the way it's going. We'll see. It's been a long time since I've traveled to the bungalow on the Ashley River marshes. I think the last time Tammy had wanted to make repairs was before her sister moved there, after the breakup of her marriage. Now the sisters live together. After ringing the doorbell, I waited a few minutes before Patty appeared from the side of the house, with a toddler in her arms. This was something new. "Hey, Max, if you're looking for Tammy, she's not here." "That's okay. I was hoping to have a little talk with you." "Hey, I don't want to get involved in what happened between you two." I interrupted her gently. "That's not the point. She's your sister, and I have some concerns from what I've heard." Patty averted her gaze, biting her lip. "I've heard she's not doing well, and I'd like to help if I can." She invited me through to the patio and offered me some sweet tea. She knows you have a new girlfriend, Max, and I think that's what triggered it. I don't know what to do. She drinks every night and started bringing guys over until I told her it wouldn't work with a baby. Well, I want her to do something to make her realize that means she has to quit drinking. I want her to be a mom to the girls in the house. I have 4 now, and I'm thinking of adding 2 more. But I need someone responsible to look after them and run things. Sadada, I thought you already had someone looking after the house, Patty asked, perplexed. There is, or at least someone who makes sure the utilities are paid and anything broken is fixed. But with half a dozen students living there, it would be nice to have a faculty mom looking after them from time to time. I could see the wheels turning in Patty's head. We both knew Tammy wasn't an alcoholic. It was her crutch, and she needed another one for a while. I'd deal with the consequences eventually, but it could wait. What's the boy's name? I asked. She looked concerned at first. Oh, I'm sorry, Max. I should have introduced him when you first arrived. It's Charlie. Long story, but I won't bore you. She tried to laugh, but she failed. I was left to wonder. Patty agreed to talk to Tammy and have her call me if she was interested. It didn't take long for the call to come. The sisters got to talking, and Tammy told me how much she missed hanging out with the girls. She kept her demeanor low-key, never mentioning Kirsten or begging for any information. We established ground rules. No drinking with the girls, no men of hers in my house, and she must register with the Dean of Students' office as an off-campus tutor. It was that last point that caught her attention. If she stumbled, she would jeopardize her stay at the university. She must control her behavior and actions. Whether she viewed this as an opportunity to gain a foothold in my life didn't matter at that point. She wasn't going to move into a house, and her socializing would be 2 or 3 times a week at most. Besides, I'd still be in Maine with Kirsten. You know you're going to have to deal with her again someday, don't you? Kirsten asked, lying in bed with me one night before our flight. Maybe I'll see you again. The sky overhead was bright blue, the morning sun was nearing midday, and we were bobbing on the ocean waves. A little girl was trying to open a pot on the deck after I had lifted it out of the water a few minutes ago, but she was so insistent that I sat back and watched her efforts. She made a grimace and pulled her gloves up to her elbows as the hatch opened and she climbed in. I'm sure the dark green crayfish with the huge claws had other plans, but she pulled it out and tossed it into the white plastic bucket at her feet to join the 4 others we had collected earlier. We were about 100 yards from the dock with my 8 yellow and black buoys, each holding a lobster trap on the ocean floor. The little girl's mother was standing on the dock watching our progress closely. The little girl, Etta, waved to her mom as we walked back to the dock. Etta was named after her grandmother Marlene and mother Kirsten, and in her 6 years, she was very advanced in every way. Say vorsichtig, Etta, Marlene exclaimed. I lifted the girl out of the boat and she ran off to her mother, while I went back to the work of securing the rigging and delivering dinner. I stopped at the dock and looked out to sea where the far shore was a mile away. I was home now, where I had been before, when I was young and learning the rigors of youth and coming adulthood. The age of 60 was fast approaching, and Kirsten and I were comfortably settled in Islesboro. She would turn 50 in the fall, and she still looked as delightful as when I first saw her. She gave me firewood and rubbed my back in times of need. We hadn't been back to Charleston since I had sold the Anson Street house a few years earlier to the College of Charleston for use as off-campus housing for the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. Tammy was instrumental in bringing the parties together after she became the new dean of faculty. She quit drinking altogether and still lives with her sister in West Ashley, helping to raise her nephew Charlie. According to Patty, there has been no significant other in her life since her divorce. Sutch sold Henry's house and invested a small portion of the proceeds in a bar in Key West, bringing in a pretty blonde girl half his age. I still can't imagine him trying it a 4th time, but they seemed quite happy when they came here last summer. It was a mild summer evening as Kirsten and I walked down our village island street to stop at a tavern for an ale. At the north end, we came across a church and meeting hall. We both stood for a while looking it over. Do you think it will fit? Well, it doesn't have a steeple, but it's white. And we continued on our way to the tavern. The end. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.